Bend Around the Wind by Skylia. Chapter 82. Scarred. Bee's wounds were severe, but Loki could already feel the flesh knitting itself together. He just focused on his task, didn't dare think about what happened in his absence. There was fury coiled tightly in his gut, but he had to ignore it. He couldn't afford to listen to it. He needed to act first. His thousand questions and gnawing worry had to wait. Bee barely started to breathe more clearly under his hands when Stark and Juyu stumbled back into the room. Hatchet was limp in their arms, too pale, too still. Loki's heart probably stopped beating for a moment, and his breath got stuck in his throat as well. He almost stood up to rush over when Stark caught his gaze. "He's breathing," he reassured him quickly, but there was worry in his voice and an almost frantic look in his eyes. Loki had enough self-control to keep himself from running to the elf. "Drongo, move or help!" Stark snapped. Drongo stood frozen, looking at the bed all this time. Now Stark's voice finally made him tear his eyes away from Bee. He immediately knelt down and lifted Hatchet out of Stark's and Juyu's arms, easily taking his weight. Loki's heart was still vehemently beating in his chest. "His skin feels very cold," Juyu said, the same worry in her tone that it was in Stark's.
"His heart also beats very weakly,"
Drongo said, looking up at Loki, one large hand spread out on Hatchet's chest.
"What do we do?"
Stark asked. Loki tried to organize his thoughts. The symptoms were easy enough to recognize, but the solution might be much harder. He still had his hand on Bee's chest as his mind raced with possibilities. He felt just a little overwhelmed for a second. "What's going on? Oh, you're back!" Someone interrupted them, and Loki looked up again to find Lady Pepper and Happy in the door. She was looking at him with such relief that Loki was startled for a moment. Then she noticed Hatchet and quickly ran closer to him. "Should I call Dr. Algren again?" she asked.
"I doubt he can help,"
Stark said.
"Loki, what do we do?"
Stark asked him again, more urgently. Loki shut his eyes and took a large breath. He had to keep his calm. "Downtown, Los Angeles," he said, looking at Stark. "The Agatha Street between Town Avenue and Crocker Street. There is an alley across from a parking lot. Get in the alley and call for Pillskin and Oakbud. They'll hear you." He memorized the location because he knew it was important. "I can't go. Bee's not—" he started to explain, but there was no need.
"Nope, you just worry about her. I can do this."
Stark nodded. "Tell them that Hatchet burnt too much magic," Loki continued. "They need to bring a Fae who's old enough to help him. Tell them that Hatchet will owe the Fae a favor. If they're reluctant to come, then promise that I will owe them a favor as well."
"Okay, anything else?"
Stark asked. "No, that's all. Just hurry," Loki told him.
"Come on, I'll drive,"
Happy said. They were both out of the room a second later. Loki's eyes drifted back to Hatchet, the blonde in his hair very disconcerting.
"Is there anything else we can do?"
Drongo asked. "Keep him warm," Loki said. "Jarvis raised room temperature to 85 degrees. Pepper said right away. "Juyu, come and help me." Juyu followed her out right away. Loki's eyes lingered on Hatchet for another long moment, then he forced himself to focus on Bee again.
"How is she?"
Drongo asked then. There was a hint of hesitant worry in his tone. It was not reassuring when Drongo was uncertain. "She'll be fine," Loki said simply. He was more worried about Hatchet at the moment, but he didn't say that out loud. Pepper and Juyu returned a couple of minutes later. Juyu was carrying a mattress, while Pepper had an armful of covers and blankets in her arms. Juyu tossed the mattress to the floor, shoved it up to the wall, out of the way. "Put him down," Pepper instructed. Drongo carried Hatchet over and carefully laid him down. Pepper was already there, covering him up with several thick layers. Loki was again a little startled by the care she showed, but grateful for it nonetheless. Juyu grabbed one of the unused pillows from Bee's bed and carried it over to Hatchet as well, putting it under his head. "He still feels cold," she said when she laid a hand on his cheek. "Is there anything else that could help?" Pepper asked, turning around on the floor to look at him. "No, we need a Fae," Loki said. Not even Loki himself could help with this, especially not after traveling back from Alfheim and helping Bee heal. "Is Bee going to be okay?" Juyu asked after a moment of silence. "Just give her time," Loki said. Juyu visibly relaxed, relieved by the news, but then she turned and looked at Hatchet, worry darkening her face almost immediately again. "And Hatchet?" Loki did not lift his eyes, kept them resolutely on Bee, focusing on the magic that flowed out from his fingers. He had to swallow before he could speak. "I don't know," he admitted. As the minutes ticked slowly by, Loki had to forcibly keep his eyes on Bee to prevent his attention from wandering. Even if her body was exhausted, she was breathing easier by the second. Loki was absolutely certain that she would wake up when she rested enough. Hatchet, though. Loki never saw this happen before, not with his own eyes. Someone like him overstraining. But he knew it was bad. He could see the dried blood on his sleeves, the eerie paleness of his skin, exhaustion written in the deep furrows on his face. 3 days. It was but 3 days. How could it go so very wrong so quickly? He didn't want to let himself be distracted by his anger, but the more time passed without Stark returning, more questions appeared in Loki's head. Whoever did this, they would pay. They were going to pay very dearly for what they had done. They were going to learn the price for such transgressions. Loki's revenge was going to be a testament of what his fury was capable of. Whoever dared strike in his absence made a grave mistake. They either did not know him well enough or already forgot what he was capable of. It was a lesson Loki was eager to teach them. Some color was already returning to Bee's skin, slowly shifting back to the rich, dark green Loki was used to seeing. It calmed his heart, but only a little. What little relief he felt over Bee was consumed by his worry for his dear friend. Stark thankfully returned within the hour. Loki heard him arrive sooner than he saw them. He was out of breath when he was inside again, so he must have run. "They said they're going to get here as soon as they can," he said. Happy appeared behind him, equally out of breath. "Can they bring a Fae that can help?" Loki asked. "They said they knew someone." Stark nodded. It only calmed Loki marginally. Until the Fae was right here in the room and agreed to help, anything could happen. "I'm going to wake Bruce up," Pepper said. "Let him know you're back." She stood up from the floor, holding the suit jacket she shed earlier in her hand. "No outside calls, okay?" Stark told her. "The breach in Jarvis's security is still not fixed. Anyone could be listening." "Then the Avengers will have to wait to receive some news," Pepper said. She touched Stark's shoulder reassuringly on her way out, and Stark smiled at her gratefully. When Pepper and Happy left, Stark walked over to the bed. "She's better now," Loki said before he could ask. "She'll heal. She just needs rest now." Stark nodded and sat down on the edge of the bed. Loki had questions to him, but he looked so very tired. He was injured and worried. Loki just couldn't bring himself to ask. Once Hatchet was fine, they would have time to talk. The telltale whisper of magic in the air came only about 10 seconds after Stark returned. Loki wanted to feel relief, but it was too soon. He couldn't know for sure yet. The two gnomes popped into existence first, obviously skilled at traveling such a way. Then a third Fae appeared. It took but a moment for Loki to see what sort of company the gnomes had brought. She was a ghoul, definitely old enough to help. She was human-sized, albeit not too tall. Her skin looked rough, green and blue like lichen, her hair a messy stack of brown. Her large eyes were watchful as she gazed around the room. There was no doubt in Loki that she had to have a more human form, but she did not bother to hide her nature in front of them. There were even delicate-looking wings on her back, transparent and glimmering. When her eyes landed on Hatchet, she narrowed her eyes and clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "That doesn't look good at all," she said. "Oh, it looks bad! So bad!" Oakbud added as he climbed up to the mattress next to Hatchet. Pillskin was on his heel looking at Hatchet too. "We shouldn't have come sooner," he said. "Can you help him?" Loki asked, looking at the quill. She walked closer and hummed, considering it. "I might," she said. "Won't be that easy, though." "He'll owe you a favor if you help him now," Loki said. The Fae were not known for doing things out of the goodness of their hearts. Loki just hoped her price would not be too high, even if Loki was willing to give her almost anything at this point. She had to know that. She was way too confident not to know the advantage she had over them. "It's going to take a lot of my power," she said, still calmly. "I'd be vulnerable for days." Loki gritted his teeth, but at least he expected this. "Then I'll owe you a favor as well," he said. "It's a fair offer, is it not?" She turned to look at him, her big gray and green eyes twinkling with glee. "I don't actually want anything from you," she said before Loki could open his mouth to bargain. Her lips stretched wide in a smile, and she glanced over at Stark. Now, Mr. Tony Stark, on the other hand... Fine, Stark said without hesitation. Loki was just about to warn him how dangerous it was to promise to face something like this when Stark continued, as long as it doesn't involve me having to murder anyone or destroy something, or aiding you in murder and destruction. The Ghoul smiled sharply again, obviously very pleased by the answer. None of that, she said. Then okay, I'll owe you one, Stark said. Now help him. Oh, pushy. She tittered, but she turned to walk to Hatchet. She pulled her small brown top over her head, exposing more of her skin. Then she knelt down to get the covers off of Hatchet. What is she doing? Jiyu asked, a little alarmed. Let her, Loki said. The Ghoul went so far as to tear Hatchet's shirt off to get to his skin. Then she laid down on top of him, covering him with her body. Is that... that's gonna help? Stark asked. Yes, Loki breathed out in relief. He could already feel a buzz of magic in the air. It was very different from his own, or Hatchet's. It reminded Loki of tooth and air and chilly wind. Billskin and Oakbud stared at them for a moment, then they lifted Hatchet's arm and crawled under it. You're going to ask for favors too? Loki asked. Nah, he gets a freebie, Billskin said as he settled on Hatchet's side, half of his tiny body resting on his ribs, the rest of him under his bicep. He's funny, Oakbud added simply from under Hatchet's forearm as he rested his little head on the elf's stomach. Loki was already familiar with the feel of their magic, the scent of fresh earth and damp grass. They even started glowing a little as they shut their eyes, lending their power. It was unusual for a Fae to help so freely, so they truly must have liked Hatchet even more than Loki thought. The Ghoul closed her eyes as well, resting her head on Hatchet's shoulder while she laid a hand on top of his heart. Her glimmering wings fluttered once in a while, but other than that, she was completely still.
What exactly are they doing?
Drongo asked. Loki was staring at how Hatchet's chest started to rise and fall more strongly than before, despite the weight on top of him. He was still pale, and he would be for a while, but Loki allowed himself to feel the full extent of relief. A horrible weight settled on his shoulder the moment he laid eyes on the damage in Stark's house. It was suffocating him to see be so horribly hurt, Hatchet so very weak. Now he could breathe again. They're sharing their magic, Loki said. That's how he was remade when he was a child, by being engulfed by the power of the Fae. This will soothe the strain on his body and fix the damage he has done to himself. And there was plenty of damage, almost too much to repair. The thought of his friend hurting himself this much both clenched his heart and fed his fury. He lifted his hands from Bee's chest, sitting back on the floor. So, Bee's... Stark prompted. She's well, Loki said. She needs rest. Her body had no time to process any of this yet. Stark leaned to the wall and rested his head on it, taking a deep breath. This must have been the first time in a long while that he relaxed even a little. You're injured, Stark. Come here, he said. It's nothing, don't worry about it. Stark dismissed his concern. Tony, come here, he said again. This time the man didn't argue. Loki shifted around until his back was to the wall, and he pulled Stark down to the floor between his outstretched legs. Once Stark was settled with his back to Loki's chest, Loki embraced him, rested his chin on his shoulder, and wrapped both of his arms around him. Stark said nothing, he just raised his hands and put them on top of Loki's. I'm okay, he said quietly. Just the thought of losing you. Either of you. We're all okay now, Stark said. Loki nodded and moved a hand over to Stark's injured shoulder. No elixir? Stark asked. It's a small wound. I can fix it like this, Loki said. If I keep pouring that elixir down your throat, I'm going to end up with the boy, and I much prefer you looking like a man. Stark chuckled lightly at the weak jest, leaning back on Loki's chest some more. Loki let himself relish in Stark's presence, the scent of his hair and the warmth of his body. Thank you, Loki said. For what? Stark asked. Hatchet. Stark shrugged.
It's Hatchet,
he said like it explained everything. Maybe he didn't understand what it meant to make a promise to a fae. What a great sign of care it was. I'll make them pay, Loki said after a long moment of silence. He did not know yet who was responsible, but this he could promise already.
We will,
Stark agreed resolutely.
but not now. You have to stay until they wake up.
In B's case, that could be just a few hours, but with Hatchet, there was no way to know how long it would take. It may even be days. Loki wasn't sure he could stay still that long. His skin itched to go and search out those who did this. He longed to make them suffer. For every wound they inflicted, for every drop of blood that was shed, for every moment of pain Hatchet had to suffer through. Stark must have felt the tension in his body because he gripped Loki's free hand more tightly.
She called for you,
he said. What?
B.
Stark said.
She called for you. She said your name.
He said.
I didn't hear, but you have to be here when she wakes up.
Loki pulled Stark even closer and nodded. I will, he told him. Stark fell into a slumber in his arms, exhaustion taking its toll on him. Loki didn't mind holding him. The floor was not the most comfortable place to be for so long, but he did not care. They were all hale and safe. Drongo sat on the floor by the foot of B's bed, while Juyu was lying on the bed itself. Hatchet was still deeply asleep, surrounded by the three fae. The room was quiet. Loki and Drongo were both awake, but they had no words to speak. They just sat silently and listened to the quiet sounds of the others as they slept. Loki didn't even care how much time passed. He remembered when Banner and Miss Pepper showed up in the doorway, but after a quick look around the room, they left without a word. Banner even lifted his hand in a strange little wave in Loki's direction before he turned away. One day, when he had time to think of something else than revenge, he was going to ask how exactly the last handful of days passed here in the house. For now, he didn't need to know that, just the identity of the attackers and those who sent them. When Stark woke up sometime later, he told Loki how the attack happened. Drongo was also quietly listening to him talk. They learned how it started merely a couple of hours after Drongo and Loki left, which obviously wasn't a coincidence. Stark told them how they fought, how the Hulk interrupted and tipped the scale in their favor, how they found Bee drenched in blood and what it took to keep her alive. Only the fact that Stark was still in his arms kept Loki from standing up to pace the room. He was certain that Stark could feel how heavily his heart was beating because of his anger. He did not doubt that Stark was just as angry as he was, but the man was also worn out from everything that happened to them.
I should have...
Stark shifted around, tensing a little.
I should have been able to handle this better.
You did enough, Loki told him.
I did nothing. I was taken out by a piece of glass. And even after, I just stood by and watched.
Tony, Loki interrupted. You did enough. He knew words were futile, so he did not say anything else. He knew the feeling of incompetence Stark was struggling with right now all too well, so he also knew that saying anything more would be useless.
I'm glad you got back in time,
Tony said, turning around a little to be able to look at Loki's face. I am too, love, Loki said. He reached out to touch Tony's face, stroked a small bruise under his eye with a thumb, and watched how it vanished from a small touch of magic. Tony leaned closer for a kiss, and Loki gladly gave it to him. Their lips touched slowly as they lay in each other's arms. No doubt Loki would have loved to strip him down and look over every inch of his body, search out every scrape and bruise, and make them disappear. He wanted to feel that Tony was alive, wanted to remind himself of the taste of his skin and the sound of his moans. But of course he could never bring himself to leave the room while Bee and Hatchet were in such a state. They pulled apart after some time, and the tingling feeling in his lips, how it felt wet and used, was enough to ground him and remind him that he did not lose anything.
Want to talk about how things went in Alfheim?
Tony asked. Loki shook his head. Later. Those things could wait. They needed to clean up in their own backyard first, so to speak. Loki did not sleep. It was more reassuring to watch over everyone else. And it wasn't strange at all that they were all in the same room, scattered in various places. Sitting still for so long made Loki relax a little. He couldn't fall asleep, but he was in an almost meditative state, his body and mind resting at last. A quiet, hoarse groan made him open his eyes again. He had no idea how much time actually passed, but it was definitely daylight outside. When he looked around, he noticed that Hatchet was rubbing at his eyes. Loki detangled himself from Stark right away, trying not to wake him, but not really succeeding. Then he was up and walking across the room to sit down next to the mattress. There were still blonde strands in Hatchet's hair, which did not sit well with Loki, but at least he was waking up. The Gwyll on top of him shifted around, leaning up on her elbow to give him more space. The gnomes remained asleep. When Hatchet finally blinked his eyes open and frowned up at the ceiling, Loki felt an unpleasant weight settle in his stomach. Because while one of Hatchet's eyes was back to its normal brilliant violet, the right iris was still a deep indigo color. Hatchet noticed him a moment later, blinking a few more times. "You're such a fool," Loki told him. Hatchet frowned again, then finally noticed the Gwyll lying on him. "Oh, not bad," he said. "Hello, dear. Aren't you a pretty one?" "Hi." The Gwyll smiled back. "So are you." Hatchet gave her a tired smile, then looked down at the gnomes spread out by his side. "Really bad," he concluded, ruffling Oakbud's messy hair a little. The gnome just grumbled in his sleep. The Gwyll sat up finally, moving away from Hatchet to lean against the wall. "His eyes and his hair are still different," Loki said, looking at the Fae questioningly. "I can't fix that," she shrugged. "He needs an elder." "What's wrong with my eyes?" Hatchet asked. "It shifted colors," Loki told him. "Oh, don't worry about it," Hatchet said and slowly sat up. He still looked incredibly tired. The gnomes jerked awake at the movement, grumbling in displeasure. "But it's not good, is it?" Stark asked. Loki didn't even notice that he walked closer. "It's nothing," Hatchet said. "It's just like a scar. It just takes longer to vanish." "Or they don't vanish at all," Bilfskin chimed in, yawning widely. "Yeah, Conch's feeling was all spotty forever," Oakbud said. He really was. Half of his fur was all brown again." Bilfskin nodded. Loki stared at the blonde strands and the one darkened eye, his lips thinning in anger. It must have been written plainly on his face because Hatchet's expression changed. His nonchalance vanished right away. "Don't fret, Loki," he said. "Is she well?" Loki nodded. "Then it was a small price to pay." "Fool," Loki told him again. Hatchet smiled and leaned forward, pulling Loki closer with one arm and holding him close. Loki relaxed at the touch and wrapped his arms around him in return. "Tactile creature," he murmured. Hatchet huffed out a small laugh. "You know it!" The Gwyll stood up from the mattress and gathered the top she dropped earlier, pulling it over her head again. "I'll be back for that favor later, lad," she said. Hatchet and Loki pulled apart. The elf looked up at her and nodded. "I'm looking forward to seeing your sweet face again," he told her. "We'll see how sweet you think I am after you know what I want," she said. "And, our business?" Stark asked. "Right." She smiled and flicked her hand, a piece of paper appearing between her fingers. She handed it over to Stark. He frowned down at it. "Nanosec electronics?" he asked. "I know, they suck," the Gwyll said. "But it's hard to build a decent career when you need to create a new identity every few decades or so." "Wait, you want a job?" Stark asked a little incredulously. "It wouldn't go amiss," she said. "My CV is impressive when I don't need to deny most of my past work experiences, believe me. I've been around for a long time." Stark stared at her for a moment longer. "I assume you can look human?" "Of course." Stark looked at the card in his hand again, then shrugged. "Fine," he said. "Pepper Potts, CEO. She's around in the house somewhere. Drivers can direct you. Talk details with her." The Gwyll just smiled again and walked out of the room. Loki was really not sure whether he disliked her or not. "I was really not expecting that," Stark said. "It's the very best thing about the Fae, Hatchet said. They change as the world changes around them.
Should we talk about our next step now?
Drongo spoke up. He was either asleep until now, or he just had nothing to add.
The air in the room immediately darkened. It wasn't just Loki who felt it. Hatchet's face grew stony as well.
We should,
Juyu agreed quietly. She was still lying on the bed, but she turned over to be able to look at them. Bee was still fast asleep next to her.
We might not know who it is exactly, Stark asked, but we know where we can start looking.
Shield, Juyu said.
Was it them?
Loki asked darkly.
We don't know,
Stark said,
but some part of S.H.I.E.L.D. had something to do with this. It might not have been Fury, but they have to know something. So even if it wasn't them, we can ask them some questions.
Loki finished.
I waited for Coulson and the Avengers to gather intel for us so far, Stark continued, but we don't need to wait anymore.
We can get answers ourselves, Juyu said. I like that plan.
Besides, Hatchet spoke, we might have to make an example out of this. Make sure everyone is aware of the consequences from now on. The gnomes giggled gleefully at those words, obviously pleased by the sharp air of anger and violence in the room. Loki was almost pleased about their delight because it showed where their alliances lied.
And if we find the culprits?
Drongo asked.
We take revenge. They all froze at the sound of that and turned around to stare
at the bed. Juyu almost fell off from how badly she startled. Bee was staring at the ceiling for a moment, then sat up. She looked down at the bandages covering her torso with a frown and absent-mindedly rubbed at her ribs. Bee? Juyu questioned tentatively, like she did not believe that she heard it right.
We will take revenge,
Bee repeated. Her voice was scratchy from disuse, hoarse from sleep, but strong and deep, resolute. Stark let out a harsh breath and stared at her in open wonder. Loki was sure that his own face was also quite spectacular. You're speaking, Stark said. Bee glanced around the room, taking in the sight of all of them. I'm aware, she said dryly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Juyu let out something that was between a squeal and a laugh and threw her arms around her, squeezing her tightly. Loki couldn't make out most of what she was saying, but she talked about her relief and her joy and how very afraid she was in the past few days. Bee stroked her hair, letting her sister embrace her for as long as she wanted. I'm here, she whispered to Juyu reassuringly. It's fine now. Stark was right by the bed too, and Loki stood up as well. Hatchet followed closely behind. Okay, screw this. I'm gonna argue, damn it. Deal with it, Stark said as he climbed up on the bed and pulled both girls into his arms. Juyu laughed again as she got trapped between Bee and Stark. Bee was never overly fond to prolonged physical contact, but she did not pull away. They looked like a pile of joy. Even Loki had to smile a little at the sight. He did not go to them. He was content with watching and feeling the comforting presence of Hatchet by his shoulder. They didn't pull apart after a while. Bee's face would have looked blank to the untrained eye, but Loki saw the softness in the corner of her lips. She was happy. Loki reached out towards her, and Bee put her hand in his, squeezing his fingers. Bee looked at him for a long moment, the same searching gaze she always directed at him. Loki smiled back at her, then leaned down to lay a gentle kiss on the top of her head. Bee looked both happy and unimpressed. It was an amusing expression. Then she finally turned her eyes toward Drongo. Hey, Drongo, she said quietly, letting go of Loki's hand. The giant was still sitting on the carpet by the foot of the bed. The happiness on his face was honest and unashamed. His lips curled up into a warm smile. His eyes were calm and glad. Bee climbed across the bed towards him, and Drongo did not hesitate, scooping her up in his arms and pressing her tightly. Bee wrapped her arms around his shoulders. Hey, Drongo, she repeated, maybe just for the sake of novelty. Maybe she just wanted to say his name out loud.
You have such a beautiful voice,
Drongo said with another smile, stroking her hair and her back and holding her tightly. There was a quiet laugh from Bee, and she just buried her face in his neck some more. Loki let the joy of the moment touch him. Stark turned around to sit on the edge of the bed and leaned closer to him. Loki rested his hand on the back of his neck. stroked the skin and the soft hair there. He took pleasure in the soft, happy sigh that fell from Stark's lips in reaction. Yes, he would let this moment of joy fill his heart to the brim before he allowed anger to take root in it again. For this very joy he felt was the reason why his revenge would be without a shred of mercy.